InvestorIdeas.com Podcasts. Welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com Podcasts. In today's podcast, I'm going to be going over a few public company announcements, the potential policy change around recreational cannabis use for the RCMP in Canada, a new study which suggests cannabis legalization has led to an increase in cannabis-involved traffic injury emergency department visits in Canada as well, and the continued rise of cannabis stocks on the speculation of cannabis rescheduling in the U.S. So first, for public company announcements today, looking at CURLF Holdings Incorporated, trading on the CSE as CURA and the OTCQX as CURLF, who announced the launch of Zero Proof, which is a new brand of THC drinkables, and it's fast-acting, sessionable, and easy to use. So Zero Proof Squeeze follows Select's popular THC-infused beverage enhancer, the Select Squeeze, which originally launched in March of 2021. It's similar in functionality and effect, but the Zero Proof Squeeze has been reformulated with natural sweetener to provide a significantly lighter taste and balanced flavor profile to enhance mixability. Utilizing nanotechnology, the Zero Proof Squeeze provides a truer to flower experience with the effects felt in as little as 15 to 30 minutes, significantly faster than the traditional edibles, and by turning cannabis oil into tiny water-soluble molecules, the THC compounds dissolve evenly into the beverage and are more rapidly and efficiently absorbed into the bloodstream. At launch, 4 delicious low-calorie and gluten-free flavors will be available, including dash and cherry, dash and of orange, dash of lime, and dash of sweet. So getting a quote from the company, Zero Proof exemplifies our commitment to providing high-quality, consistent consumer products in familiar and approachable formats that model traditional consumer packaged goods, said Matt Darren, the CEO of CURLF. Now, CURLF has been on the forefront of creating sophisticated cannabis experiences, which we believe will ultimately redefine the way people socialize. We're proud to bring Zero Proof Squeeze to our patients and customers in Illinois first before expanding to additional markets. So, CURLF expanding into a new beverage program, obviously again similarly based off of what they've had in the past. Nano emulsion for the beverages is something I've talked about a bunch in the past on this podcast. It's definitely where things are all heading when you're looking at the beverage side of the cannabis industry. It's become pretty commonplace now, so I wouldn't say that it's something that's quite unique to any company. There's a lot of different companies who are using some form of nano-emulsion technology for their THC-infused beverages, even some of them for their edibles, and there's also been a few that are doing it for the sprays. I do think it shows, and in the last couple of podcasts I talked about this as well, of other public company announcements that have been talking more and more about the beverage industry. We are just starting to see a general uptick or trend towards these companies focusing on the beverage side of the industry. If you've been paying attention, which I assume you have, to how cannabis has sort of evolved since legalization in Canada, beverages was very much sort of touted as the big boom side of the industry that was really going to take over dramatically. So far, we haven't really seen that materialize into anything realistic. Beverages has increased its share maybe more-ish over the last few years. I think it's up to like 15 or 20% in some markets, but that's about it. And even that might be a bit of an overestimation. In general, you're still seeing dried flower take up a huge percentage of the market. Pre-rolls take up a huge percentage of the market. Concentrates have definitely picked up a lot, and edibles is kind of in line with beverages. You've seen most of them be pretty competitive and staggering in most of the markets they're in, whether the U.S. or Canada. And I think the biggest thing, and I've talked about it a bunch on this podcast, is the fact that really there's not the same social infrastructure that's there for the alcohol industry or for any beverage industry for that matter that there is for the cannabis industry. So there isn't a cannabis coffee shop. There isn't a cannabis lounge. There are a few in California and Nevada. I don't think there's anything like that in Illinois at the moment. And as far as I know, in most other states, all the consumption lounges aren't still an option. In Canada, we're just starting to approach the idea of this, and it's still very much at the beginning phase, so I wouldn't expect anything to materialize too dramatically where you're actually going to see cannabis cafes or any sort of recreational lounges show up. And that's the big hurdle for whether you're looking at beverages or edibles. Sorry, I got flies buzzing around me, which, we got a lot of plants in our house, so it's an unfortunate reality of things. But I really don't see this taking off until that hurdle is sort of crossed. Without places for people to be able to consume these products in a social setting, it's just never going to turn into something more than, the occasional sales of these. That's a fundamental aspect of the alcohol industry. And, even when you're looking at the caffeine industry, when you're looking at coffee and tea, if there wasn't places to go to sit down to enjoy all those, if it was just, standing kiosks that sold you coffee everywhere, it wouldn't be as dramatic of an industry as it is. But the whole coffee shop culture is a big aspect of why companies like Starbucks and blends and all the different versions of that have become such a massive thing. And then we've also seen that with kombucha, where you start to see kombucha, lounges show up. That's what creates that industry and helps boost it along. Same thing with smoothies and sort of health-based beverages. But if you don't have the sort of consumption area to go and basically consume these products in a setting that's catered to that, it's hard to get any traction within the beverage industry that's very meaningful. Obviously, you can still sell your beverages. I don't think sales have dropped for any of these. I think for CURLF, this kind of shows they have actually increased their sales of beverages year over year, and they are taking up some more market share, but it's not any sort of huge boom that's that significant, and it's still not any sort of huge competition for the rest of the other cannabis sectors that are out there. Again, even for CURLF, they're still going to be selling mainly the dried flower, the pre-rolls, concentrates, the other aspects would take up larger margins of the overall sales. And so it's interesting to see. Like I said, there was a few acquisitions. There's been some growth within the beverage sector. Obviously, there's a lot of companies who are positioning themselves well for if and when more consumption lounges become available in different states or in Canada. But so far, again, we haven't seen this materialize too dramatically. And I think that there's still a lot of hype and speculation when you're looking at the beverage side of the cannabis industry. But it is an interesting trend to note that obviously a lot of companies are trying to reignite the beverage sector and getting themselves positioned for what they assume is going to be another big growth boom for that sector. They must be aware of something that I'm not when it comes to these consumption lounges, because I know that even a lot of the people I've talked to who are making these beverage products, they all say the same thing, that until we get places where people can go to consume these products, and that's basically the environment that they're in. Obviously, for a lot of these drinks, you could pour them into a different can. They don't have a unique smell to them. You could bring them into a movie theater. You could do things at the beach, etc. That's kind of the discreet style of some of them. Allows you to take them with you to other places. But people don't like feeling sketchy in general. It's something that, with the growth of legalization, there's a reason that more people are consuming cannabis. It's because they actually feel like they have a legal option to do this. Most people, at least the vast majority, don't like choosing things that are illegal. They don't like choosing things that feel sketchy or make them feel like they have to hide what they're doing. And the same thing goes for the beverages. Obviously, it's more discreet than smoking a joint out in public or having a vaporizer device where people can see the smoke coming away from you. And you could just say, it's just a drink. Some of them look very generic looking. They kind of look like a soda pop. Or some of them, like the squeeze, you're pouring that into something else. So realistically, you could have that in a water bottle with you and no one's going to be the wiser. But it's the social structure behind that. People don't like that. They don't like feeling like they're doing something that's taboo or sketchy. And so once we actually have, again, more consumption lounges, more areas that are devoted to actual cannabis consumption within the business, when you have a cannabis restaurant or cafe. And again, there are a few examples in California and Nevada, but they're not the rule, they're still the exception. And until that changes, I don't really see the beverage sector or the edibles sector taking off in any significant way. Obviously, there's a lot of companies, you have to position yourself early so that when that market opens up, you can really take advantage of it. But something to pay attention to is it looks like a lot of companies are repositioning themselves to expand in the beverage sector of the cannabis industry. I don't know if they're aware of some sort of changes that are going to be happening that I'm not. But as far as I know, we're not going to see any sort of massive growth of consumption lounges anytime soon, but who knows. Next, looking at Aurora Cannabis Incorporated, who trades on the NASDAQ and the TSX as ACB, who announced an expansion of its hemp-derived CBD portfolio into Brazil. So its partnership with Herbarium, which is the leading Brazilian full-spectrum single-source 3% CBD oil under the Herbarium brand, is now available under the direction of the medical doctors. Patients across Brazil have access to high-quality CBD as part of their healthcare. We're proud to continue our international expansion and bring quality CBD products to Brazilians alongside our partner Herbarium. a trusted brand in the market, says Andre Jerome, EVP of Global Business Development of Aurora Cannabis. Brazil has strong growth potential, and we look forward to leveraging our leadership in the market to further unlock key opportunities in South America. So nothing really new here. There's been a lot of Canadian companies who have been looking into South America a lot. I've talked about this a lot. For me personally, I'm rooting for South America to really start dominating the cannabis space when you're looking at the long-term potential. Once this becomes potentially, and I know there's a lot of people who are skeptical about the idea of cannabis really becoming an international business, but I'm hoping that one day there will be more options for international trade with cannabis products, and if that is the case, countries in South America definitely have the leg up when it comes to grow conditions, when it comes to expertise. Colombia specifically, as I've talked to a few people in the past who have made the point that Colombia is where basically like 90% of the world's cut flower market comes from, and that's just actual traditional flowers. And so if they were to able then to utilize that same skill set, that same labor market in the cannabis industry, where they have multiple grow cycles a year for outdoor grow, they have a extremely cheap but highly educated labor market when compared to a lot of other countries in the world, and they could be producing at around 10 cents to 5 cents a gram potentially if they were allowed full expansion. It's interesting to see of what the future would be, as if countries in South America, which have been most dramatically affected by the war on drugs in the past, could then become sort of the dominators of the cannabis trade in the future, where they're supplying most of the raw material, and that companies in the US and Canada and other parts of the world would actually just be then using their product to turn it into second tier products. So, cannabis 2.0 products such as beverages, edibles, concentrates, etc. Because obviously I think that when it comes to the sort of lab infrastructure that's required to make some of those cannabis 2.0 products, the US and Canadian companies have a leg up, obviously, on South American companies. They have more access to funding. They tend to already have more educated professionals in those types of trades. When you're looking at people coming from the pharmaceutical sector or the beverage sector into the cannabis industry, it's pretty easy to adapt to most of that. But again, when you're looking at sort of the raw flower element, I do think that places like Colombia, specifically Mexico, and most of South America could actually have a huge hand in the future of what cannabis is as an industry. And there's a lot of companies that are positioning themselves there. Obviously, Aurora Cannabis, there's been a bunch of companies. Mostly they're focusing on CBD products still, because that's kind of the only access point they can have at this moment. Again, in Colombia, there still is medical cannabis, but it's pretty heavily regulated, and most of that is coming from Colombian operators. Most of them are involved with a Canadian company in some facet, but it's still not as big of a market as I think most of them would hope for, but the same could be said about the EU marketplace, which I've talked about a bunch in the past. Realistically, everyone's still looking for some sort of recreational market to open up, and that's where a lot of these Canadian companies can actually really benefit and start really, taking advantage of the full potential of those marketplaces. But for now, people are making baby steps. Aurora Cannabis continuing to advance into Brazil. A lot of people talking about Brazil as one of the next big markets for a lot of the wellness products when you're looking at cannabis, especially when you're looking at hemp and CBD. So skin creams, lotions, beverages, different sort of health and wellness products. Obviously, they have to be careful about what sort of claims they make on most of these products, but there is sort of a benign generic health and wellness category that they can fit into, kind of the Nature's Fair or Whole Foods version of things, where there isn't as much regulation and there still is enough of a high enough margin for those companies to really profit. So I would pay attention to over the next couple of years to see how much South America does continue to expand, Brazil specifically, if we start to see those wellness products really take off. But for right now, again, it's mostly just positioning for a lot of these companies, hoping that things are going to change enough for them to really take advantage. Lastly today, looking at Hemp Incorporated, who has been cited as one of the key players as the future scope of industrial hemp, and which is set to reach apparently $18.6 billion by 2027. According to the latest report, which was published on September 1st of this year, it was titled Industrial Hemp Market Industry Increasing Demand, Energy Trends, Growth, and Future Scope by 2027, provided a quantitative analysis of market segments and current trends, and Hemp Incorporated is profiled as one of the key players driving the market. So you can look up more of the information on Hemp Incorporated. Again, I've told you in the previous podcasts, check out the articles that are attached to this. They provide more information. They also have the backlinks to the follow-up articles where I source this information, so you can read in detail how all these things are being sort of portrayed. I will say Hemp Incorporated, obviously they do have their Hemp Incorporated, so they do have a lot of different hemp products. They have positioned themselves well for sort of the industrial hemp market. So far, that hasn't really been able to take off just because of the regulations surrounding the hemp industry, whether in the US or in Canada. It's still really tight when it comes to the margins, and it's still really difficult to get to any sort of large-scale industry where you could actually be producing this at a cheap enough cost to be producing all the textiles or concrete or waste cleanup or different aspects of hemp that I think have actually much more potential than actually cannabis does overall. This is, if you get into the sort of conspiratorial world of the cannabis industry, this is what a lot of people discuss is the main reason for why cannabis was sort of vilified and criminalized in the first place, is not because of the cannabis drug aspect, but because of the hemp aspect. Because when you're looking at hemp as a textile, so when you're looking at it for clothing or any sort of fabric, it's actually much more durable, and you could be producing it at a much cheaper rate than a lot of alternatives. When you're looking at hemp as a plastic alternative, it's much more environmental and, again, much more sustainable to produce at scale because you don't require heavy drilling. You're not requiring the oil industry basically to provide the materials to make your plastics, which obviously there's a lot of talk these days about climate change and environmentalism and blah, blah, blah. I think most of that is just a lot of hype to promote new products that are just as environmentally detrimental as their counterparts that they're blaming in the past. But that's my own opinion. But again, hemp actually is an extremely environmental alternative to a lot of the products that are out there. So plastics, textiles. Obviously, the easiest example is paper products. When you're considering that we're cutting down trees to wipe our ass for toilet paper products, it's pretty hard to imagine that we're anywhere concerned with the environment or climate change or any of these things, because trees are the best source of absorbing carbon from the air. And we literally cut them down to wipe our asses with them. And we could be using hemp, which you could grow in much tighter areas with much faster turnarounds of growth. Obviously, growing a tree doesn't take 6 to 8 months, but indoor grows of cannabis can do that turnaround. Some of the more advanced grows can do that in sometimes 4 months. So you could be producing product for much cheaper at a much faster rate of production, and it would be environmentally sustainable compared to what we already have for the entire paper industry. So textiles, plastics, paper, that's just 3 of the things that hemp could contribute to. I'm not going to get into all the other things like hempcrete, which has been discussed. There's been a few articles circulating around where you're talking about old bridges from the old world, is that they used hempcrete, basically hemp in the concrete as sort of a binding agent, which allowed the structure to maintain itself and be more weather resistant over a longer period of time. There's a lot of crazy stuff that hemp could be doing when you're looking at it as a food source. So hemp oil and hemp seeds, cereal could be a competitive aspect for that. Obviously, for basically the entire, rapeseed oil and canola oil and those types of products, which have been shown to have lots of negative health side effects. Hemp oil, by comparison, again, more sustainable to produce, and also it tends to be healthier for your body because it actually reduces inflammation, it helps with your gut fauna, and again, it's something that in overall would be beneficial. So if you read into this report, it kind of addresses a lot of these things that if you are looking at this from a strictly scientific perspective, the industrial hemp industry is poised to take over the entire world in the future. The problem is there's a lot of regulations, there's a lot of lobbying against this because there's tons of industries which would be eaten alive if this were the case. If you allowed for hemp to compete the same way that, again, big oil does, especially if there was subsidies attached to it, which is so far from reality at the moment. I don't think there's any government that's actually going to start subsidizing the cannabis industry, especially not the hemp industry, but that could be a potential thing, maybe 20 years out. And if you ever did get to that point, again, the environmental impact would be quite substantial. The cost change would be quite substantial, and you would also get better quality products. But I don't know how far that is to being a reality because, again, there's not just one segment of industry that would be affected, but dozens. And most of those groups have paid a lot of money to have their position within those marketplaces, and I don't think a lot of them are going to give that up anytime soon. Obviously, there could be a few of them that realize the wave of change is coming and adopt hemp into their already industrial structure to kind of save their asses. I haven't seen a lot of that coming out either, but companies like Hemp Incorporated, if regulations get changed to a point where hemp could actually compete in an industrial scale against other industrial products in the textile industry, in the plastic industry, in the paper industry, then Hemp Incorporated would be very well positioned and would be able to do a lot of stuff quite rapidly. Also, that would very much depend on its access to funding and capital, which is another big discussion that I've talked about a bunch of times in the past. Unfortunately, these companies are hindered by a lot of different things, and it seems like there's a lot of money out there that's competitive money that wants to keep it that way. That realistically, there's a much more interest financially to make sure that these companies, whether you're looking at cannabis or hemp, stay in the position they're in, which is struggling financially, rather than get access to capital and be able to compete in the same space that other industries are able to compete in. So, something to read. I definitely recommend reading that full report. Again, it kind of just outlines a lot of these obvious points that I've made. It outlines the technology that is there. It outlines the cost benefits of this. It outlines the environmental benefits of this. What it doesn't talk about is the fact that there's a huge amount of lobbying money against this, and that the vast majority of regulators will not allow this to happen anytime soon because it would be suicide for some of the companies that are their biggest backers. So, in recent news, the RCMP has suggested easing a policy that requires frontline officers and many other office employees to refrain from recreational cannabis use for 4 weeks before duty. This is a 5-year-old policy that, in general, has slowed down recruitment towards the RCMP and frontline officers. So it doesn't just affect the frontline officers, but it also affects a variety of other employees. Basically, under this, there is a 27-day restriction on when they can consume recreational cannabis. If you've heard me talk about the difference between cannabis and basically all other drugs as far as how it's stored in your system, this is one of the biggest issues ever, because realistically, just by having that 27-day limit, you basically just can't consume cannabis because cannabis lasts in your system on average for up to 90 days. It can almost always test even further than that, depending on how much you've been consuming. And it's really hard to detox out of your body because it's not stored just directly in your blood, it's stored in your fat cells. THC binds with our body in a different way. So when people say you have a blood alcohol, a THC blood content of XYZ, there's a lot of inaccuracies with that reporting. And there's been different breathalyzers that have come out. There's been different urine tests that have tried to come out to be more accurate within a shorter distance of time. And a lot of them have found inconsistencies over and over again, or they're extremely expensive to use, so people don't use those testing options. Some of the best ones that have been the most accurate tend to be the most expensive for a single use, so most of the time when it comes to job testing or police testing, roadside testing, etc., they don't use those most modern testing methods because they'd be too expensive to justify basically the ticket or the cost of that employee, etc. So potentially, this is going to get changed. All RCMP employees must be fit for duty when reporting to work, which includes not being impaired by alcohol or drugs, says a notice on the RCMP website explaining the policy. Science shows that cannabis can intoxicate beyond initial consumption, and that there are no established safe limits or data on how it affects performance. Without established scientific information about cannabis impairment, the RCMP policy is taking a careful approach at this time to ensure workplace and public safety is maintained at all times. That's a statement from the RCMP. It is interesting to note that some of the main endorsers of cannabis these days are athletes and people who are performing at the highest level, and they actually use cannabis during their performance at high levels. When you look at the NBA, turns out almost all of them are high most of the time, and that's how they perform at a better level. When you're looking at lots of different athletes, they're using it for either training or recovery or even the performance itself. So it's kind of difficult to say we don't know how this affects you, because there are extremely high level performers who use this specifically to perform at a higher level. So it's kind of confusing. I've talked a lot about in the past the interesting discussion of data and science when it comes to cannabis. There's a lot of disregarding of real science that has come out over a series of decades, and then there's a lot of favoring of data that often is quite misleading, if not blatantly incorrect. I don't know if there's ever going to be enough data that comes out to convince people that cannabis is actually quite a safe drug when compared to almost everything else out on the market. Again, we're not testing to the same extent when it comes to even things like aspirin, which actually could have detrimental effects to an employee, especially a frontline officer. There actually could be issues there. Testing for alcohol, alcohol gets out of your system a lot faster, but the impairments of it last in your system a lot longer. There's a lot of different things out there that you can detox out of your system quite quickly that are much more harmful and sketchy than cannabis. And then there's also the entire pharmaceutical side of things, where we kind of just ignore that whole industry if people have a prescription for it. And so, I could talk about this forever, that cannabis is always going to get an unfair comparison when compared with literally almost every other substance on the planet. Again, there's never been a reported overdose of cannabis, and people have really tried. If you've gone to any sort of cannabis convention or seen people who are doing those dab contests online, it turns out they're maxing out what they could try to consume. When you think about that, that's a concentrated form of THC, and they're sometimes smoking multiple grams at a time. You couldn't do that with almost any other substance on the planet. Even if you did a concentration of tomatoes or onion or something benign that doesn't even matter, most likely it would cause more harmful effects and actually lead you to go to the hospital. But this doesn't happen for cannabis. And yes, people do admit themselves to the hospital, but there's nothing they do. They basically just give them some liquids and tell them to wait it out, because there is no thing that's actually going to happen to you physically. It is a mental issue. So yes, you can have potentially a psychotic break because you can get too paranoid and weird, and you could be experiencing panic attacks, but not actual heart attacks and not actual physical conditions that are going to lead to you needing physical attention from a medical professional. And this is debated a lot, but the evidence is quite clear. People have really tried to push this and nothing has happened. And really all you get a lot of the time is people eating edibles that they didn't realize were edibles, or people, basically just being stupid with this product. And even when they are so stupid with this product, they still just go to the ER and people basically tell them to chill out for the next little while, and that there's nothing really they can do other than sit and wait for the product to get out of their system. Again, if people make the same mistake with alcohol, they can actually die very easily. And there's no limit on how much alcohol you can buy at a store. You can buy the maximum amount you want. You can drink yourself to death any day of the week you want. You can buy as much Tylenol as you feel like. You can kill yourself with Tylenol, no problem. But it's pretty much impossible. Again, I'm going to say pretty much just because you never know. Someone could figure out a way to try to kill themselves with cannabis and overdose. But so far, even with people really actively trying, no results have been actually forthcoming. So this unfair comparison is always going to happen. And again, when you're looking at how cannabis is stored in the blood and in the body, it's a very unfair comparison when you're trying to do it on a testing level. But potentially the RCMP may change its position. Hopefully they'll start looking at studies from athletes and also from PTSD victims and people suffering from anxiety. These are things that would actually affect officers. And so if officers were less anxious and more relaxed and didn't have their PTSD coming out when they're dealing with potentially traumatic events, I could see that actually as a beneficial situation. And there also could be a way where the RCMP actually just does it on a person-to-person basis, where you actually say, okay, well, I want to use recreational cannabis. And they go, okay, cool, we're going to have a specific test for you, where you have to go through a series of tests to see how you can function under what level of cannabis impairment. That would actually be really interesting for me. Personally, I would love to see the results of that, of how some people differ with their cannabis use and how some people can actually improve their performance. And I'm sure, obviously, some people are not going to be able to handle their weed, just like lots of people can't handle their drinks, lots of people can't handle their caffeine, lots of people can't handle their sugar, lots of people can't handle food in general. We have more food addicts than we have addiction of anything else on the planet. And that's just food. We don't have a license to go and get food. There's no limit on how much food you can buy. Most people can't handle that shit. So it'd be interesting if they did a pilot program with RCMP officers who did want to use recreational cannabis to say, okay, we're actually going to do tests to see how you perform. We're going to do written tests. We're going to do physical tests. We're going to do situational tests. And we're going to see how you can perform under which dose. You say, I want to smoke this much a day. Perfect. You're going to smoke that much, and then we're going to see how you perform. And they could do it in a controlled environment where they can actually have the data in front of them. And some officers might actually surprise them with improved results as opposed to a decrease in functionality. And, I know why that study's not going to happen anytime soon, because no one wants to have a study come out that says, yeah, cannabis improves your functionality, because then all of the different media outlets that are always trying to vilify cannabis, and all of the different companies that are lobbying against cannabis, and all the industries that want to say cannabis is a drug, you got to be careful, it's sketchy, blah, 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 suddenly they wouldn't know what to say, and then they would have to go after the study itself and say, well, actually, those people lied, and the data's lied, and blah, blah, blah. So, I would love to say that that's going to change, but most likely not. Speaking of studies, according to a new study, which I highly recommend you read in full, because once you read the study in full, you might find some issues with the study. You might find how the data is presented is slightly biased towards a certain outcome, and that there is a lot of missing information that could be extremely important to what the overall outcome of this data set is. But this study, which is available again, backlinks in the article, it suggests that over the span of 11 years, annual rates of cannabis emergency department visits from cannabis-related traffic injuries has surged dramatically. So the study was published this Wednesday in the JAMA Network Open, and it looked into cannabis involvement in emergency room visits for traffic injuries between 2010 and 2021 in Ontario. It also examined shifts in cannabis consumption and driving habits following federal legalization in 2018. Our data is raising concern about a growing pattern of cannabis impairment and severe road injuries, said lead author Dr. Daniel Myron, who is also a fellow at the Breyer Research Institute and the University of Ottawa's Department of Family Medicine. Since 2010, there has been a very, very large increase in cannabis involvement and traffic injury visits in Ontario. So, when the study is looked at under closer examination, we do see that there is no data on which percentage of the 7,564 alcohol-related traffic injury ED visits and the 426 cannabis-related traffic injury ED visits, and if they had any crossover. One of the issues that I've talked about a lot is that often when it comes to impairment in emergency room visits, is people will often cite alcohol and cannabis separately, even though the person could have consumed both. So they'll report it as both a cannabis incident and an alcohol incident, even though technically it's one incident, and we don't report the crossover. And what we don't always say, and the reason we don't do that, is because obviously alcohol is the lead impairer in that situation. And for cannabis, the other problem is it's stored in your system for a long time. So, for instance, you could be passing over what is the legal limit because you smoked weed 3 days ago. And then you could go out drunk and crash. And they're going to say, well, cannabis was in your system, and technically it was. So technically that could be classified as a cannabis-impaired driving incident. This is the issue there. We also don't test if there was other substances. Cannabis often gets related to other drugs as well. And again, we don't differentiate between if you had multiple substances in your system or if you had simply cannabis in your system. And this study doesn't go into the details of if any of these 426 versus the 7,564 alcohol incidents were tested for cannabis only. So that was all that they had in their system, and there was no other substances, including alcohol, that was in their system as well. It's one of those things that if you look into that, that number could dramatically change the outcome of the results. Another thing is In the past, cannabis was just compared to all other substances. So there was alcohol and then there was substances. And now cannabis is identified as its own separate thing. And so since we've started dealing with it as a separate entity, which has been since legalization, of course the increase goes up because now you're testing for it in a different way than you did in the past. It used to just be they had impairment and it was substance impairment. It didn't specify whether it was cannabis or cocaine or opiates or heroin or meth. It just said you either had alcohol or you had substance impairment. And now we're focusing specifically on cannabis. So for all we know, in the past, there was the same numbers of cannabis impairment. We just related it to substance impairment and didn't differentiate it as its own individual subcategory. Whereas now it has its own individual subcategory. So of course they saw an increase. And in this study, they say the increase was, guess what? By 426%, which means that we went from 0 to 426. Does a lot of things that, again, I could comment on this for a while. I highly recommend you read the study. Maybe I've misinterpreted it wrong. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a person who tries to read things. From my layman's perspective, it seems like there's some missing information from that study, and it seems like it has a certain bias inherent in the study. And it also seems like, from my personal perspective and anecdotal perspective, I just haven't seen a lot of people who get high and then go driving. When you're really high, you drive real slow, if not at all, because you're super paranoid. Any person I've anecdotally talked about who's driving high said, I thought everyone was a cop and they're driving 20 under the speed limit because they're paranoid as hell. People who are drunk drivers get bold. They feel like they're race car drivers. That is not how you feel when you're high. In general, obviously that's anecdotal, obviously that's just based off my life experience and people I've talked to in dozens of different settings, but I'm sure there is data out there that does support that yes, there is an increase in impairment, but there's also an increase in use. And you also have to realize that there's some people, because cannabis is a newer drug to their system, who don't know what their levels of intoxication are, unlike with alcohol. People have a much more basic understanding of, okay, I had one glass of wine, I know I'm good. Or I had a beer, I know I'm good. Versus with cannabis, yeah, you could be smoking a high THC joint and suddenly you're more high than you realized. And this is always going to be the issue with cannabis, at least for the next decade or so, is that for the vast majority of people who haven't been smoking their whole life and are now just entering into the recreational space, they don't really know what their dosage level is and they don't really know how to self-regulate to the same degree that they do with alcohol. Another issue is that cannabis has often a delayed effect, especially when you're looking at edibles. So someone could have eaten an edible, thought they were fine, then went out driving, then the edible hits them. This is also a very common story when you look at some of the cases where people have been too high driving or have had incidents with cannabis. A lot of the time, it's the latent effect of cannabis. It's the fact that, especially with edibles, they're going to hit you probably half an hour to sometimes an hour later. And that also depends on your own metabolism, your body mass index, and a lot of other factors. And so I would say, unfortunately, a lot of this still comes down to we're just very uneducated in general as a populace at how to use this drug. And as we continue to vilify it and highly regulate it, unfortunately, people don't get accustomed to how they should use this. And that's kind of the double-edged sword of this, is that because we're so scared of it, people unfortunately don't understand how they should be using it. There's a lot of ways to understand how to use alcohol. It's very socially accepted. So most people go through these trials and errors of, oh, I got too drunk this once, I threw up, blah, blah, blah. People explained what I should drink. I've learned over time. You know, you get into your later years and you can understand your alcohol better. With cannabis, everybody's kind of at layer one. Even people who are older haven't had much experience with this most of the time because, again, people didn't want to use an illegal substance. And so people of any age could suddenly be blindsided by how much the cannabis impacts them at what time, because they're just unaware of how the dosage is going to affect them and how it has a latent effect. So hopefully there will be more products, for instance, like CURLF's nano emulsion drink, which is fast acting. Fast-acting products are definitely a benefit for everyone, not just for the consumer who just wants to get higher faster, but also for the industry when it comes to safety. Is you just don't get as many problem scenarios of people suddenly eating or drinking too much cannabis, and then an hour later being like, oh no, I've done messed up. And unfortunately, by that point, again, there's no way to quickly detox. Even with alcohol, you could have your stomach pumped, you could fill yourself with liquids, you can kind of simmer down. With cannabis, that's it. You just got to ride that wave. And for some people, that wave might be too much, and they're going to crash. So lastly today, cannabis stocks are up. Cannabis Growth, CURLF, Leaf Fly Holdings, Tilray, a few other companies. They all had a boost in the last week. This is still based off the speculation that cannabis is going to have some big change this year, as reported by Marijuana Moment, and I will say, love that group. They do great reporting on the cannabis industry. I highly recommend going to them as a resource for all cannabis news. They're fantastic. MJ Biz Daily for more of the financial side of things. Marijuana Moment much more for the social and regulation side of things. They stated that President Biden has been very clear about the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes, because he's really adamant about that, even though he was part of the three-strike system, which saw the vast majority of cannabis-related criminals going to jail. So, of course, he's really into it, even though his entire past does not reflect that whatsoever. So there's a lot of speculation that because the HHS recommended a rescheduling, as I mentioned in our previous podcast, that this rescheduling is a guarantee. Just because they've recommended it doesn't mean that the DEA has to go through with it. And again, they can delay this as long as they want. There's no scheduled time that they have to decide on when this rescheduling occurs. It's simply they've been given a recommendation. There is data for that recommendation. But there's been data for recommendations to change the scheduling of cannabis for a long time. Turns out, just because the HHS did this doesn't mean it's a guarantee that it goes through. And there's a lot of ways for the Biden administration to basically say, like, see, we're on board. This is what my team's doing, without actually doing anything. They could delay this by a year. They could delay this by 3 years. Next year's an election year in the U.S. Obviously, at the moment, this is good press for the Biden administration. They can say they're doing something without having to actually do anything. They can have Schumer talk about the Safe Banking Act and say it's a priority without it actually going through. This has happened dozens of times so far. We've talked about safe banking, we've talked about regulation changes, we've talked about descheduling, we've talked about decriminalization, we've talked about, we're going to let all the people out. Biden only did that at a federal level, and it turns out only about 1,000 people were affected. The vast majority of people who had already been convicted of cannabis crimes were still in jail at a state level, and nothing changed there. This is the kind of hollow rhetoric that shows up a lot when you're discussing cannabis, as a lot of people like to say, we're going to do stuff, while doing zero. And I would be very cautious about the optimism surrounding this. It doesn't seem likely that anything's going to happen anytime soon. Obviously, if the Biden administration continues to get more criticism and pressure, there's a good potential that they could do something just as good press for them during the next election cycle, but my guess is they will just allow this to be delayed until they have a guaranteed win in the next election. And if they do get that, then they can also then delay it further by just disregarding it like they've done multiple times. The Safe Banking Act has come through multiple times. There is a lot of bipartisan support for that, and yet nothing has happened with it. For rescheduling, there is a lot of data that this should be available. There's a lot of data that there should be a legal medical cannabis industry in the U.S. There are thousands, if not millions, if not hundreds of millions of patients throughout the U.S. The vast majority of states have legalized cannabis in some fashion, at least medically, and a huge chunk have even legalized recreationally. Most people, when you're looking at the polls, it's 70 to now sometimes 80% in support of at least decriminalization, rescheduling, safe banking, or at least a medical industry. People want this, but just because people want it doesn't mean that it's going through anytime soon, because again, there's a huge amount of financial interests that do not like the idea of this coming through. The pharmaceutical sector, the entire medical industry is not endorsing this. It's a small segment of that industry that endorses cannabis as a medicine. A small subsection, and most of those doctors risk their careers to support medical cannabis. It's not vastly endorsed, and it won't be anytime soon because there's a lot of other products, there's a lot of other companies out there who profit massively from cannabis not being able to compete with them. Again, this is the same conversation when you're looking at hemp. It is really good. When you look at all the data and look at all the information, you're like, why isn't this everywhere? The answer is it's too good. When it's compared to its counterparts and other industries that already exist, you go, oh, that's why, because they would lose billions of dollars overnight if this was allowed to compete at the same level. Why can't cannabis advertise? Because it's apparently 10 times more dangerous than alcohol, even though there's no statistics to support that. We treat it like it's more sketchy, but we allow for alcohol ads all the time. Alcohol sponsors sporting events. Those same sporting events should be sponsored by cannabis, because that's actually what the athletes are using. The athletes aren't saying, yeah, after a hard workout, nothing like getting drunk to recover. But a lot of them smoke weed to recover from their high performance jobs. So, unfortunately, my personal opinion is there's going to be nothing from this. There's going to be a lot of talk in the news over the next couple of months. There's going to be a lot of speculation on when something's going to happen. You might even see another thing go through the House, through Congress. It's not going to go through the Senate, and the DEA is most likely going to delay this scheduling until next year because they need more data or blah, blah, blah answer. It'd be awesome if the DEA did actually change this and reschedule cannabis. That would be a huge opening window for a lot of these industries to allow for more medical research and to start boosting this program. But it seems highly unlikely that this would happen because, again, there's a lot of people who profit from this not going through. And I don't see the Biden administration specifically actually being truthful in their endorsement of cannabis, because when you look at basically his entire cabinet, the vast majority of them do not have a great reputation in the past of supporting cannabis initiatives. Obviously, again, there are some people in Congress. The vast majority of the Senate, though, is still pretty strict about not being into this, and because most of them have financial ties to competitive industries. That's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.